Being autistic comes with a unique set of sensory difficulties. Sensitivity to sound, touch, taste, smell. So what happens when you embark on a journey that is pretty much 9 months of sensory and hormonal overload? I'm talking, of course, about being pregnant while autistic. Being autistic while pregnant. Whichever sounds better, I don't know. Now, since I seem to like having disclaimers at the beginning of my videos, number 1, this is simply my personal experience of being pregnant. Number 2, some autistic women have very different, i.e. much easier pregnancies. And number 3, I am still not a medical professional, so please don't make any important decisions on the basis of watching this video. Always talk to your doctor, please. So I'm going to start with the first trimester. I truly believe that this is the hardest time, and especially when society dictates that you shouldn't tell anyone until 12 weeks. I guess you're supposed to be suffering in silence? I don't know. I was a bit strange because I did actually tell a few people around me when I was about 5 weeks pregnant, because I felt like I was being really dishonest about it. I often have kind of a compulsion to tell the truth like that. I feel like I'm keeping a secret and that's a bad thing and I have to tell people about it. So hiding this huge part of what was going on inside me felt very sort of alien. During the first trimester, I really did need support from people because pretty much from the moment of implantation, and yes, I do know when that was, that little embryo sucked almost every last remnant of energy and vitality out of me pretty much immediately. I knew I was pregnant before I took the test at about 4 weeks because we had gone to the Christmas markets in Düsseldorf in Germany, and that day I had to come back to the hotel 3 times to lie down because I was so exhausted. So during these first 14, 15 weeks or so, I was nauseous, I was exhausted, I had quite low blood pressure, and I would be out of breath from climbing up the stairs. I would sound like I'd just run a sprint. And of course, this is ridiculous. People think you're being ridiculous when you suffer like this. I know suffering during this time is really not unique to autistic people, but I personally am very sensitive to hormonal changes and changes in my body in general, which a lot of autistic people are. It also doesn't help that I have very many comorbid difficulties such as celiac disease and PCOS, which all kind of contribute to having a lot more going on in my body than maybe the average person does. But I didn't have a clue that I was autistic back then. I had some shady friends who are no longer my friends who thought this was an ideal time to bully, harass, and gaslight me when I was at my most vulnerable. Partly because of that, I developed anxiety and depression during a time when I felt like I was just supposed to be so happy and grateful that I was pregnant because I thought it was going to be such a struggle having PCOS. And shouldn't I feel so delighted and excited and lucky that I had a healthy baby? I don't really think that prenatal depression and anxiety are talked about that much, especially compared with postnatal depression, which appears to be more common perhaps. But I definitely felt it, although to what extent I'm still not really sure. I know that I took a long time to feel connected to the idea that I was actually going to have a baby. I was adjusting to being pregnant, but the idea that I would actually get a baby at the end of it was a bit like, well, really? Are you sure? Is there a catch here? So how that translated for me was that I didn't get a lot of cute baby things. I didn't get really excited. I was kind of miserly actually. I would go online and try and find like baby clothes off Free Cycle and secondhand stuff, which is also good for the environment. But I know now that I was sort of punishing myself a bit because I didn't feel excitement, and I didn't necessarily think that maybe buying some clothes might help get me in the spirit of things. But a part of me was honestly scared that if I started getting too excited about the baby, then something would happen to it. And I know that's kind of like a superstitious thought. During this time, I was so anxious that I did end up finding myself having these sorts of thoughts. So like I said, I did tell a few people early on that I was pregnant because I knew that I would need the support if I carried on feeling quite so awful. But people didn't really support me the way that I'd hoped. And when you're out and about, you don't look pregnant. No one offers you their seat or cuts you slack. Because as one of my delightful former friends put it,
"You're not that pregnant. I had a friend who was 9 months pregnant with twins and she was walking around."
And you can't really compete with that sort of spectacle no matter how terrible you feel on the inside. And I know that I sort of did get to 9 months just, but I got to that point and I would be 9 months pregnant any day before I went through the first trimester again. But how does this relate to me as the undiagnosed autistic woman that I was back then? Well, the toll that early pregnancy took on my body was immense. And when my energy is low, I really struggle with peopling. Peopling? So I struggled to make friends and maintain friendships, and I made a few mum friends, but I found it hard to relate to a lot of what they were saying. I also found it hard to talk to others at prenatal Pilates class or the childbirth classes and things like that. I didn't really know what to say other than, well, we're all having a baby, aren't we, I guess. And of course, my humor is a little bit dark, so I would make jokes about the baby being a parasite, which it really feels like. And I guess not everybody else appreciates that kind of humor, especially when they are also probably quite emotional and sensitive. So I just found it really hard to do the people thing when I was exhausted all the time. And that's something that's kind of carried on to after childbirth and beyond. Now my son is 2. But the peopling thing extends further than just like finding it hard to talk to friends or whatever. I found it really hard to communicate to my midwives and medical practitioners and things like that without getting stressed or upset, because I felt like they weren't listening to me. And this is something that I think probably a lot of women also feel, but I think it's even more so for autistic women because they don't necessarily communicate in the way that might be expected of them. And this is why I believe that getting a diagnosis is so important, especially for women who are going into this phase of their lives. Because if I'd known back then, firstly, I would have cut myself a hell of a lot more slack. And secondly, I would feel justified in making demands for things that I needed, especially with midwives or in the hospital, for example. If I do ever have another child, I would definitely prepare something, like a document of some kind, for my healthcare practitioners. In the UK, the National Autistic Society has a scheme called a hospital passport, which you can use. It's a 5 or 6 page document, PDF, that you can download. I'll stick a link down below for it. And it kind of takes you through the things that cause distress, things that might help you, how you like to be communicated with, that sort of thing. And I think that is useful. It definitely has its place. But when you're in hospital environments, you might have multiple people coming in during a day. And I think, to be honest, they're all very busy. It's unrealistic to expect that everybody who sees you reads through a 5-page document about your needs. I think that's unrealistic, actually. However, I do think that making up a document, maybe a 1-page document, with some bullet points would be more useful. And just to give you an idea of the kind of things that I think I would say if I could go back in time, I would say something like, I'm often in way more pain than I will communicate through my facial expressions. So often I will be in a lot of pain, and the way that I deal with pain is by keeping very still on the outside. So actually the more pain I feel, the quieter and the more stiller, I've got no idea what English is today, the more still I become on my face. The next point, I don't understand pain scales from 1 to 10. If you say, is your pain a 1 or a 10, I'll be like, but is 10 having your leg cut off? What is 10? Have I ever experienced 10? Or is 10 the most pain I've ever experienced in the past? And then has that really been the most pain I could have ever experienced? Or have I just been lucky that I haven't experienced pain? So when you ask autistic people to list their pain on a number scale, it doesn't make sense to a lot of us. So don't do it, please, if there are any doctors that are watching this. The next thing that I would say on this document is, if I'm suffering mentally, if I'm really depressed or anxious or worried about something, I will often downplay this because I don't want to cause any extra work or hassle for the people that I'm talking to. Because in my head, I'm like, everybody is busy and everybody's more important than me. So me saying, oh, I'm feeling really down and I'm feeling depressed and I don't feel connected to the baby and that kind of stuff, to me, that's not important. I've always downplayed my own mental health because, well, there's probably somebody in the next room who is a lot worse than me, so mine doesn't matter as much, but I'm comparing myself to a theoretical maximum worst. The next point I would say is, please don't touch me without asking. And I mean, pregnant women get touched all the time, and I'm just gonna get t-shirts printed next time saying, do not touch on me. But also for medical staff, I think that's important. Although I think that medical people are generally better trained in this, and they usually ask before touching you. But more importantly for me, please don't administer drugs or injections without explaining exactly what they are for and why I need them and whether I need them. Whether I need them or whether it's recommended. I really like to be in control over what people are doing to my body, and so somebody doing that can cause me a great amount of distress. And so those are the kind of basic points that I would list on a document. If I was pregnant again and I was developing this document for dealing with midwives and in the hospital, this is the sort of document that I would list. And maybe also like, I don't communicate, so I need some time to process things, so don't expect an answer straight away, stuff like that. And there is no guarantee that people will pay attention to this, but at least having listed it out helps people like my husband, or if you have a doula helping you, helps them know how to advocate for you. Now, I briefly mentioned pain while autistic, and autistic pain is something that's very interesting and it's kind of a bigger topic for another video, I think. But many autistic people are hypo or hypersensitive to a lot of stimulus, including pain. And we might not react in the way that's expected of us to react when in pain. So it's really problematic if somebody is assessing how much pain relief we might need, especially during labor, based on the facial expressions that we're making. And I was in some ways lucky with this because I ended up with an emergency C-section, and of course they give you pain relief for that. So it was never in a position where I had to sort of beg for pain relief or anything like that. The thought of having my pain not being believed is terrifying to me. And I'm not a big fan of hospitals in general, but that is like one of my worst nightmares, being in excruciating pain and having somebody tell me that I'm not. Essentially medical gaslighting. But I'll get back to the actual birth a little bit later. But just coming back to the first trimester for a second with nausea and food aversions, you might know from a previous video that I used to be a really fussy eater. I did a video on autism and food issues. If you want to check that out, it's up here. And when the first trimester just kicked my ass, it was like I'd gone back in time to childhood and I could only eat the most bland foods imaginable. So there were weeks where I basically survived on just cheese toasties or sometimes ham toasties, but meat was a bit iffy for a while. I couldn't go to the weekly market to do a food shop because the smells would set me off and I would sort of be sat there or stood there gagging. The smell of a fried egg in the kitchen would make me so sick in the living room that I'd have to wrap a scarf around my head. And I never actually threw up, funnily enough, but I did wish that I could have thrown up because it might have relieved my nausea in a way. And this eventually did get better. I was very unfortunate though, because in my second trimester, which is supposed to be the good trimester, I actually developed labyrinthitis, which is kind of an ear infection, and I was really terribly ill. I guess fate just hadn't finished dumping on me yet. So I had about 6 weeks of my second trimester where I couldn't walk in a straight line without falling over because I would be dizzy from the ear infection. And for other various complications, my amniotic fluid was slightly low, so they were basically putting pressure on me to have scans twice a week by the time I was about 28 to 30 weeks. And we were having to go into Amsterdam, and my anxiety was just through the roof at this time. If I'd known then what I know now, to be honest, I would have just said no to a lot of these things. But I was sort of scared and somewhat intimidated into complying with their suggestions. They were concerned that the baby was small, and I was here going, well, I was small as a baby, and I'm pretty small now, and you're comparing my statistics to the Dutch people, which are the tallest nation on earth, and they have some of the biggest babies on earth when they're born. And so I was having these statistical debates with medical staff who weren't trained in statistics, clearly, and it was turning me into a nervous wreck. And you know, if considering I already had quite a lot of anxiety, all this extra stuff was just, it was too much. So by 34 weeks, I basically said enough is enough. And I wish that I would have had the courage to say that sooner. And I think now if I ever had another child, I would definitely be like, no. And know that I can actually say no, because it was very unclear as to where the line was between having to have something and wanting to comply and being a good patient and actually pushing against your own needs and pushing back against that and saying, no, this is what I need, and I need right now not to be bothered twice a week for scans. So eventually I went back to my local hospital, but that was at 34 weeks when, you know, the birth was approaching and they would have had better facilities should a premature birth have happened. I mean, they were scaring me with saying, oh, you might have to go into labor at 31 weeks, that sort of thing. And it was based on nothing. So as it turns out, women with PCOS tend to have smaller babies anyway, which nobody ever mentioned at the time. And my appetite was never really there throughout my whole pregnancy. So, you know, there were reasons why he would have been a little bit smaller than average. But when you're pregnant, it just suddenly seems like you have so many people suddenly involved in your life, and it makes it really hard to say no and stand up for yourself, especially when you're not very well. And one of the things that if I were to do it again, I would definitely look into getting a doula for the birth and maybe parts of postpartum period. And if anyone knows if there is a company or someone who has experience of doulaing for neurodivergent women, please let me know, actually, because I think that would be a very good thing to do, is to be a doula for autistic women. But I was not very good at planning ahead back then, so I was about 36 weeks and I was just thinking, maybe I should look up getting a doula for the birth. That sounds like something that might be helpful. And then my waters broke suddenly. So as my baby was breech, which I already knew, I knew pretty much at the moment the floodgates opened that I was going to have a C-section. So I had about 30 minutes to adjust to this. And looking back, I know that I had been scared of childbirth. I know the whole pregnancy I was scared of childbirth, and initially I wanted a home birth because I just wanted everybody to be away from me and not have all this unnecessary medical intervention and stuff like that. But because of the complications, I knew I'd have to go to hospital, and then I knew I'd have to have a C-section, but it still doesn't take away the shock of going into labor like that. And I was sitting there watching cat videos and all of a sudden my water's broken and I'm facing surgery. And that was a huge shock to me. I know it would be a huge shock to anyone, but that whole evening, it was hugely positive. Of course, it was the birth of my first child, but it just happened so quickly. I mean, it was 2 hours between my water breaking and having my son presented to me, less than 2 hours. And it was sort of a semi-nightmare because, like I said, you're just suddenly facing surgery, like kind of a big surgery. Nobody really gives you a chance to adjust to it. They give you an epidural, thankfully. I think they also gave me morphine at that point. I can't remember, but I remember feeling like I was in this sort of state of semi-nightmare. I really don't mean to scare anyone off having kids. Actually, C-section was not as bad as I thought it would be, but I'm just trying to tell you about the sort of shock and the adjustment that never really got a time to adjust. All of a sudden the baby was there at 36 weeks. And I just want to say, I really don't mean to scare anyone, because if I could give advice, I don't want to be giving medical advice, but I will just say that there is a reason why generally doctors and gynecologists will opt for a C-section. I found it a lot better, or at least a lot better from the horror that my imagination had conjured up. And obviously every woman's experience of birth is different, and every autistic woman's experience of birth is different. But I think having someone there, because obviously my husband was there in surgery with me, but it was his first child too, and he was scared. And he was in shock, he was just settling down to dinner. I would really say that if you can afford it, or if you can find a way to get one, maybe a student doula or something like that, or a support worker, try and have somebody like that in the room that knows your triggers and knows how to advocate for you. One last thing I just want to talk about is anaesthetic. And I remember being terrified about the anaesthetic during my C-section because I always thought that you get an epidural and you don't feel anything from the waist down. That's the point of it, right? But the problem was I didn't feel pain, but I still felt something. I had a tingling sensation in my legs pretty much throughout, and I could feel them, messing around in my belly. It was really it was quite a strong sensation. The way that, I can't remember if I heard this somewhere, but it's kind of like somebody's violently doing the washing up in your tummy. Violently. So I just remember saying to my husband, don't let them start the surgery yet, it's not kicked in properly, the anaesthetic has not worked. I was really, really worked up about this. Obviously the anaesthetic had worked in a pain relief sense, because I think they were probably doing the surgery as I was saying that. But now I know that autistic people react differently to pain. They react differently to painkillers and drugs and anaesthetic. I think next time that this is something, they should be doing research on this. They should be doing the different ways that autistic people react to things like this. Because I spent the whole surgery really, really worried that they were going to cut into me and the pain relief wouldn't have kicked in, and I was basically going to do it like they did before anesthesia. So this is something that I want to have a good conversation with the doctor before it happens next time. And I don't know, I think if it's possible, I would opt for a C-section next time. By choice. That's my personal preference. But anyway, I'm not here to try and convince any of you. I'm just telling you my experience. Being autistic and pregnant was really, really hard on me. And the sensory aspect was overwhelming. And having my energy drained in such a new way totally floored me. Dealing with people during that time was stressful and upsetting. And I just had this huge 9 months of anxiety and depression, really. I'm not really selling autistic pregnancy, am I? I know there's a lot of people who have wonderful pregnancies and they love it, and that's why they end up having loads of children. And that's great. I'm really glad for you. But I just want to point out that it was worth it, I promise. Not only for the beautiful baby boy that I had, but having a terrible pregnancy made the postpartum period seem light and breezy in comparison. When having a newborn has this reputation for being like a blur and sleep deprivation, all these kind of things, I felt a lot worse when I was pregnant than, the first 3 months postpartum. Literally the day after I gave birth, it was like a weight had lifted, literally, I guess. I suddenly was able to eat all these foods again. I could eat eggs again without gagging. I could eat all this fresh food that I just couldn't touch throughout my pregnancy. I remember walking around 3 days after the surgery, like my health and vitality had just been restored and I felt like me again. So I really don't want to scare anyone into making decisions based off of my own experience. Especially when it's like, no, I'm not having a kid because I watched this video on YouTube and she had a terrible time. Please don't do that, no. But I want to point out that if pregnancy makes you feel awful, it does come to an end. It feels like an eternity, but it does end and you will feel better. And I am guilty, definitely, of putting off another pregnancy because I can still remember what the last one was like. But as they say, not only is every person different, but every pregnancy is different. So it could be that maybe the next time I won't have such a bad time of it. And I know some people who glowed and they did sports throughout, and then 6 weeks after the checkup they were back into sports and stuff. And for me personally, I got acne and cried a lot. Everybody's pregnancy is different, but we just have to cut ourselves some slack. So the main advice that I would give myself if I could go back is to advocate for your own needs. Eat what you can and don't stress too much about healthy. Unless, of course, you've got gestational diabetes and you're eating sugar, that's a problem. Rest some more. Literally just block out everybody else's well-meaning advice. And seriously, find a support network, even if it's just 1 or 2 people, even if it's somebody that you have to pay to be a support, like a doula, find somebody to help you. I hope you have enjoyed this, and if you want more videos on autism in women and girls in particular, I have a playlist right over here. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.